Thanks very much for having me. Well, I don't know what people's experience has been, but I think one of the sort of key features of this season has been obviously isolation, that we've been stuck in our homes and cut off from friends, from family, and with isolation very often comes loneliness. And loneliness is different from just being alone, and solitude, which can be helpful and beneficial and important. And sometimes, we need to seek those things. But this is different. This is imposed on us by circumstances beyond our control, and we're cut off. But I think one of the reasons that this season has exacerbated people's mental health and well-being problems is that mental illness actually brings its own loneliness and isolation. And so what's happening is just compounding, it's just piling on top of that. I think there are a number of ways in which this works. So one of the things with depression particularly, and other sort of forms of that, is that you start believing things that go around your mind that aren't necessarily accurate or realistic about the way things are, but they have a slightly distorted sort of perspective. And you start believing that and start assuming that when you see people act in certain ways, you know exactly why they're doing what they're doing, and read into it probably the most negative and sort of hostile interpretations you can. And that compounds the sense of isolation, because you think, well, these people are doing this because they're out to get me, or they don't like me, or they've had enough of me, or they're embarrassed by me, all these different things. And so within ourselves, we naturally want to retreat. We want to sort of pull back from that because of the exposure and the shame of that. So we've got this dynamic inside that actually forces us to do probably the one thing, or one of the things that actually is least beneficial for us, which is to withdraw. And yet at the same time, and I know that many people find this, is that those around us who don't really get these kinds of sensations, these perceptions, these distortions, they find it very difficult to relate to and understand what you're on about. And that's nobody's fault. I mean, how can you relate to something that is so beyond your own personal experience? It's very difficult to imagine. It's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of somebody dealing with this, especially because, well, we've talked a bit about the physical symptoms, but they tend to be internal. Someone with depression actually may look fine, may even look quite smiley and chirpy and happy, and completely mask the turmoil and pain that's going on inside. And so when you try to talk about some of this stuff, I don't know if you found this, but people find it a little bit awkward, or they're just not quite sure what to do. And so perhaps even a little embarrassed about it. And you just have those sort of awkward silences, and you sort of kind of agree to not continue. They find it embarrassing, you find it embarrassing, and so it's just easier not to try and persevere with it. And they very often and naturally will not come that close again, or they won't put themselves in a position where they find themselves having to engage with this kind of thing. I mean, we all do that, don't we, with things that are beyond our experience or alien to us. We naturally recoil from things that are other, that are foreign, and it takes a step of courage, really, to say, no, I don't like this, or I don't understand it, but I am going to try and find out. So very often you find this double whammy, that mental illness causes you on the inside to withdraw, and those around you, unless they really are intentional about it, causes those around us to just keep their distance for all our sakes, as it were. And this is a disaster for all kinds of reasons. But when this is happening in a situation of isolation anyway, and we all know what it's been like with this sort of physical distancing and social distancing, so-called, we've tried to keep in touch with people, but I find when I'm at my weakest or lowest, the thought of engaging somebody else yet again is just sometimes too much. And then with all the sort of Zoom and Skype sort of aspects added in, I mean, I think we've all been zoomed out over the last few months. I mean, it's been an amazing thing to have and to be able to use, but there's definitely too much of a good thing. And the thought of going on to another Zoom conference call or whatever it is just sometimes overwhelmingly negative. And so we find ourselves in a very sort of dark and difficult place. I think one of the things I would say is that actually we need to begin by looking for friendships, looking for connections in places that we might not necessarily anticipate finding them. And that means, I think, in all kinds of other media and means by which we can connect with people. And I would say personally, from my own experience, I found reading a book written by somebody who's not a Christian, but who died about 15 years ago or so, I can't remember exactly the dates. I found reading this particular book, the author is William Styron, and it's a little book called Darkness Visible. This was one of the first books I'd read by anybody that articulated something that I could immediately relate to. It took somebody who was a novelist, and a brilliant novelist at that, to be able to articulate the things that can't be articulated. I mean, that's basically what we're dealing with. And I find so much of the language we use for mental illness utterly inadequate and feeble and useless. And it took someone like William Styron to begin to find some of the language. And it was as if I'd found a friend. I'd found somebody who actually was giving me the vocabulary. And so suddenly, by reading this old book, I didn't feel as isolated as I had. Now, ultimately, I would say we find that in extraordinary ways in the Bible. I find particularly the Psalms are full of that. And you find when you start looking for them, the Psalms, which is basically the old Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, their songbook, if you like, is full of people describing, well, things that actually were uncannily similar to some of those moments. And it was like, whoa, there's this ancient friend I've got from 2.5 millennia ago, if not longer. I was finding friends there. And then ultimately, of course, that's what Christians say is true of Jesus. I mean, it sounds like a cliche and a bit naff, doesn't it? To find a friend in Jesus. But I think there's something supremely true and important in particularly this context, because he understands every aspect of what it means to be human. He was and is human. But there's one verse, I think I'll just sort of pick one verse really, that has been a real bedrock for me, because it talks about Jesus's humanity. And there's just half a verse. It's in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 2. And he's talking about all human beings. And it says, Jesus is not ashamed to call them, us, brothers and sisters. In other words, he is not afraid of finding out about us. In fact, there's nothing about us that would surprise him. He's not put off by that. He is somebody who knows us better than we know ourselves, including all that darkness that we might be battling inside, and says, I still want you on my team. And for me, that was like a sort of lightning bolt. That was a remarkable, life-changing recognition. Suddenly, there might have been people around who couldn't handle it, but here was one who not only understood, but could seriously handle it and walk me through. And I would testify over the last 20 years or so that that's precisely what he's been doing. There have been many times I've doubted that. There have many times I've struggled to hold on to that. But the bottom line is that has been the bedrock. He knows, and no one else can truly say, I know what it's like. I mean, they can't. But he can, and he says, I still want you on my team. And that has kept me going.